Hey everybody, it's Tom, and we are coming to you this week with Nick Bascom. I was going to say inimitable, which he is, but we had another inimitable guest last week, so I'll choose an alternative positive adjective, such as, I almost said tremendous. But he is, but I don't know if I want to associate ourselves with someone else who has been commonly invoking that term. Never mind, it's a contest for discourse.
It's a discursive struggle.
So last week we were with Andy Cosson, and we talked about how narratives form in response to market fluctuations to conceal, as it were, the scandal of the irrational, which is at the heart of those operations. And what do we mean by the irrational? The Marxist tradition, to which we gave some allusion at the end of our talk with Andy last week, has some useful things to say, and we're going to come around to that, I believe, eventually in the conversation. But before coming around to that, I think what Nick's going to talk about initially is the concept of the text and what is involved in reading a text, and how, in fact, you can see the world itself, reality itself, as a text to be engaged, interpreted, and so forth. So with that, by way of prefatory remark on my part, let me turn it over to you, Nick, and talk about that, the textuality.
Right, sure. And I know that we're going to pay special attention to some of Frederic Jameson's thoughts, and some of the main ideas that sort of run through the Political Unconscious, the book we have here on the table. They have to do with the text, and he tells us that texts come to us as always already read. And there's a lot of work we have to do to understand the dynamics of the act of interpretation upon a text and how those transform the text and mediate it. And so you're right. That is a framework. That's a lens that we could apply to anything. And when I used to teach rhetoric and composition, I would tell my students everything is an argument, right? And so it doesn't really matter what medium it appears. There's always the possibility that we could shift our focus to that dynamics of the active interpretation of whatever that message may be, and especially with the form in which it appears, or the technology that allows it to be transmitted or exist.
Well, in fact, we were talking. There was an anecdote that that I was sharing beforehand that actually can be inserted here as germane. And first time I got in trouble at the workplace, it was one of my first jobs. I was a cashier, and it was at Myers. I'm just going to go ahead and say where it was. Audaciously, and it wasn't.
We're probably legally protected, I'm sure.
So it was, they had these teal polo-like jerseys. They weren't offensive. There was nothing like intrinsically, repellent about them. But at the time, I had a predilection for a more formal dress than I do now, for all sorts of reasons. But I was like, I'm going to go a little above and beyond, and I'm going to come into work with a button down and a tie. And they remonstrated me for that initiative, and I was obdurate. I continued to do that, and then on the third time they sent me home for the day, and they said, no, people are going to confuse you with management, was the reason why they insisted. But it comes back to the question of how everything has a meaning, and there's an argument, and you can sort of look at unfold that text, right? The text of that anecdote and that happening.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess you're saying like the protocol of like attire at any company, right? Like there's the rhetoric of dress, I guess you could say, right? Like that they're trying to present a certain model, a certain hierarchy, I guess, in a way to kind of conform to some external notion of stability, prosperity, right? Like that there's some sort of, in their eyes, like inherent structure of those things, and that in that sort of maintaining that power structure through, I guess, the attire itself, is a form of argument. Sure, it is. I guess you could consider it that way for sure. It's rhetoric. No.
So rhetoric is not just an oral thing; it's very much symbolic, and even something as banal as a dress code. Though I guess in a way that's almost too obvious of an example. Try to think of another sort of subtler way in which the text of reality.
Well, I think maybe something that might be relevant, to the discussion is there's a lot of like we just had a lot of political debates, right? And so it's like even as the debates are going on, is that almost or simultaneous with that is the interpretation of the debate, who's winning, who's losing, right? And it's almost like that interpretation of the debate becomes the substance of the debate itself, right? It becomes like layered over top of it, but at the same time it becomes almost simultaneous with it, right? And so largely people might not even really be considering what the two people are discussing, but what is the reaction to it, who's winning, and we accept whatever that might be as the truth, the reality of that debate. Oh, this person's winning because that's what this poll says. Whereas that notion is sort of very abstract. And there's been a lot of also critique of the polls, of the debates, which also then starts to, itself sort of gain momentum as the reality of the situation, because it kind of mediates the two.
Well, I mean, I would almost put it even more radically in that the interpretation, to come back to what you were saying with the Jameson,
yeah.
And we're going to turn to Jameson more explicitly in the next segment, but the text comes to us as having already been read. In a way, the interpretation of the news actually has already occurred before the news presents itself. The news or the debate or the event is just an occasion for the announcement of this interpretation. So, in addition, there's the added wrinkle that you have a common object of scrutiny, whether that be the text of the debate, and it is received differentially by multiple parties. Mm-hmm. So going into it, it's something of a folly to think that anybody is really going to be swayed or moved in their opinion by the debate, because in fact, by and large, their minds are already determined, and what reflects that is that they already have operating lenses which are going to decipher the bare content of the interchange to mean what they want it to mean. Now, there is, I do feel that there's a temptation to see this way of reading the event as unduly fatalistic. Am I suggesting that it is impossible to approach something with an open mind without a conclusion before having received it? I say it's almost impossible. I think there actually is a space of openness, but it's an elusive in a small space, and it takes a real discipline to actually be able to enter into it. Yeah. There's a simile I once heard about freedom by a guy, Ken McLeod. He's like, well, we're free, but we're about as free as a violin in its case to wiggle.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, what is your response to that?
Well, I think the awareness of that dynamic might be the only thing that does create that sense of freedom. And I think you're right. I think there's an obvious way to sort of interpret, like, the dynamic of active interpretation is already taking place, and that even more conspicuously, one of the candidates suggested to his party that they vote in these polls even before the debate occurred. So it's almost like that preconceived idea of this is going to happen no matter what they say. We're going to vote. But there's also then the framework of sort of the political that exists before, like you said, sort of creates that encounter of the debate itself, right? So like we receive the debate through that already existing political structure, and that affects everything as well. We have to interpret it through that framework as well.
Well, so we will pick that up after the break here. So from the text to the dynamic of interpretation and how the political space creates the basis for how certain events are received. So we'll come around on the other side. So we're back, and where we left off after some prefatory remarks about the text, approaching the world as a text, dynamics of interpretation, and the space of the political is one where this sort of thing occurs. We were referencing specifically the presidential debates and how, in a way, there's an interpretation that almost occurs before the debates even happened, and that's sort of almost egregiously exhibited in that one of the candidates exhorted his supporters to begin voting even before the debate occurred, to indicate that it was not a genuine opportunity for people to make an assessment as to their preference. And this, I believe, will dovetail nicely into the specific offerings of Frederic Jameson in reference to what he calls the political unconscious, where we are often sort of drawn to participate in movements and perspectives almost in a non-volitional fashion. And it's this which allows us to sort of be drawn into and to cooperate with particular interpretations, even apart from the content of what we're encountering. So maybe, Nick, you could sort of unfold more explicitly what does Jameson mean by the political unconscious? How does that connect with some of the themes that we were referencing in the previous segment?
Right. So, there's a couple quotes from the book which might be relevant, but you're right that, it's obviously the title of the book too, right? But Jameson is saying that, at its core, this subtext, if you will, of every text has this sort of political angle, right? And that we should, I guess he sort of recommends that we read these texts as essentially allegorical acts, right? But that at the, I don't want to necessarily like assume a structure of the text necessarily, but that there is always this motivation for towards the political with sort of with every text. There's another quote which is sort of germane to, he sees every text as a meditation on the destiny of the community, which might be a way of understanding what he means when he says that there's this political unconscious, right, or at the core of a text. So every text is sort of is always thinking about or meditating on the community, right, and where the community is going to go. And a lot of Jameson's thought too about utopia is obviously related to this idea of the community and how we conceive of the collective or of our community.
Now, I think it might be useful, it occurs to me, to consider a text which is not obviously political, or at least which does not seem obviously political to many people.
So like a classic allegory, you mean? Like The Wizard of Oz or something like that? Like,
well, no, I wouldn't use that example because,
Yeah.
in fact, that example was written as an explicitly
yeah.
political one.
Yeah.
It was referencing debates over currency determination
Yeah.
in the late 19th century, thus the Yellow Brick Road.
But it's one of those texts though that a lot of, I mean, most people who watch it today are probably totally unaware of that political subtext, right?
That's true. But what's also additional is like that actually opens up to another question. It's like you can take something and then you can extricate itself from the original context, and
Right.
in that extrication make it feasible to apply a meaning which may be even antithetical, if not at least in tension with the originally intended one.
Yeah.
So we can look at that problematic as well.
Yeah.
Like if you take the movie, for example, what is being exposited politically, right?
Right.
There's definitely a set of social relations which is being advanced in The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
You've got the Lollipop Guild.
That's true. Yeah.
And there's clearly how would a radical feminist construe what's happening there?
Yeah.
I think that it's definitely an ambiguous movie, despite having a strong female protagonist.
Yeah.
In many ways, the doctrine of the good witch,
Mhm.
indicates a kind of ultimate submissiveness and the romanticization of home, and
Right.
there's a demonization of the urban. It's
Sure.
it's complicated.
There's also, but I mean, if you're taking a Marxist perspective, which of course, Jameson would, there's also sort of the exposing of the illusion of the wizardry, right? Of the
machine,
the titular, yeah.
Don't look.
So it's in
Behind
that
the curtain.
in that way, it's sort of, I guess I would say maybe its central message is about sort of the uncovering of an ideology, right, which is an important project in sort of the Marxist tradition. So you could.
Yeah, no. I mean, the example that came to I was going to ask what you thought about.
Sure.
And this is take a text. If you take an article from Nature or from Scientific American,
Sure.
about about some development in genomic research, right? Many people, I think, would be inclined to say, well, that's not political. These are just the facts of the matter.
Right.
How do you think Jameson would read scientific texts, or what is the political valence which is in the background of those kinds of assertions? Because they play a very important role in our general discourse.
Sure. Well, you bring up the word discourse, and we were kind of joking about discursive struggle, but there is that element to it. The discursive struggle, Jameson talks about that more so in An American Utopia, but discursive struggle is a struggle to legitimize ideas by way of the vocabulary itself. And so if you think about the existing framework of, like, I used to write for Science News, actually, which is, very similar to Scientific American.
Right.
But it already has, in other words, it already assumes a legitimation of scientific ideas and their influence on our thought and our sort of political stances. So it already it already presumes that that structure. But also for instance, I wrote an article on polar ice caps melting, right, which has a tie-in to a very prominent political
the whole set,
quagmire, right? But it plugs you in, But in just talking about the mere fact of the melting and the rising sea levels, like you are informing, a political issue, but in that way, in using the scientific vocabulary and in referencing the scientific thought process, right? Like the scientific method itself,
right.
You are in that way attempting to legitimize that use of reason and sort of forming your political stance, for sure.
And I want to highlight that it's a specific use of reason, which imports certain categories that I feel are construed in the general conversation in a naive and hence problematic way. So, for instance, the notion of objectivity.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also certain epistemological presumptions, which are held perhaps not necessarily, but at least probabilistically. One of those is that reality is actually knowable, that we are in a position to actually assert an understanding of the universe in a totalizing manner. And in conjunction with these categories of objectivity, absolute knowability, they're explanatory tropes which are carried over. Probably the most notable would be that of causality. It's a particular rendering of causality, which, and this is a problem that has been acknowledged from the outset of modernity, does not comport conveniently with the notion of human freedom or agency. And when these sorts of things go unquestioned, then I would aver that serious political consequences follow in their wake. So you could be reading about, just the mere facts of temperature in the atmosphere, but depending on how you treat them, especially with reference to the question like global population, you can put yourself in a very problematic space politically. Now, maybe we can carry this over into the ideals which are implicit, the utopian ideals which are implicit in various discourses in the next segment. So we'll leave it there for the moment.
Okay.
So, coming out of the last segment, we were sort of rounding the corner into the notion of ideals, perhaps even utopias, which are implicit in our conversation. And, the background for that, sort of what we've been doing so far, can largely be situated in Frederic Jameson's book, The Political Unconscious, which was written in the early 80s, I believe. But he has a sort of more recent offering, American Utopia. And I think that maybe we can sort of draw some elements from that into our conversation with reference to the idea that there are ideals implicit. And also, you may be interestingly juxtaposed with that is the question of the political as an actual sphere, because you're talking about, he also mentions the withering of the political. But let me just turn it over to you, because I've been gabbing a lot.
So you're right, he does preface a lot of the ideas that appear in American Utopia in the conclusion here of the political unconscious, and we start to see a lot of the ideas that are become more fully fleshed out, and it's almost as if the launching point here in the political unconscious is, okay, this is sort of what needs to happen, or could possibly happen, and then the goal of an American utopia is to describe how it could happen, right? What's the vector that, and Jameson takes a pretty unconventional approach to realizing utopia, but yeah, we start, one of the things he starts to mention here too is the relationship between utopia and ideology, and one of the things he cautions too is that in this sort of realizing of the vision of utopia, that if any political party that would seek to do that, or unit that would seek to do that, needs to be mindful of sort of the powers of nationalism and religion and fascism, and not to ignore those. Otherwise, that process could be rendered sort of impotent. So he cautions against that, but then he sort of seeks a totally different source of that power to sort of bring people together in an American utopia. But you are right. There is a pretty dramatic shift from sort of the look, consideration of the political in this book, and then he starts to describe. I'm assuming that his vision or his definition of the political has always been very nuanced, but that he starts to talk about the withering of the political and seeing the political as basically an avenue that really won't lead to the radical transformation that could sort of solve the problems that late capitalism poses. But yeah, he starts to see the political as synonymous with statecraft, and in that way, sort of a bulwark of the system that already exists and oppresses.
It almost comes to assume sort of technocratic aspect, and it was noted beforehand. We were talking about there's an analogy which might be accidental between a distinction implied by Murray Bookchin, who is an anarchist or communitarian thinker, who noted that, look, you can talk about the political in a positive sense, where you have an ideal of a community which works in a consensual manner to address social matters, vis-a-vis something that could be sort of called radical democracy. What I mean by radical democracy, very quickly, is a mode of organization where everyone is directly, as opposed to indirectly, involved in the resolution of questions before it. Now, this is not what we generally mean in our day by the political. What we mean when we talk about politics or the political are people who inhabit a certain infrastructure or bureaucracy that enables certain kinds of projects to be undertaken in a broad and coordinated fashion, but really principally serves to preserve and even amplify the terms of class relations with which we are presently saddled. And as such, it becomes really anti-political if one is committed to the former notion that Bookchin outlines. So the parallel with Jameson is that I feel in the political unconscious, he's operating with the idea that we can recuperate something more like that original positively political ideal of community involvement, albeit not in the same way as Bookchin, because he's drawing more explicitly on the Marxist tradition. So you're looking at categories of assertion where the idea of the proletariat, for example, assumes a larger role than it would in Bookchin, though it's a tricky matter. But we can bracket the minutiae for present purposes. What I think is happening in American utopia is that the inflection is less on the positive sense of the political and more, like you said, the negative one, where you have an emphasis on statecraft and bureaucracy. And what I think is happening with reference to the idea of the political unconscious is that the reimagination of the political as a sort of professional category actually leads to the annulment in most people of the idea that they themselves are involved in any kind of political activity, which is really a false.
Well, you hear that all the time.
Apprehension.
People always say, "Well, I'm not political."
Right.
I think even maybe most famously recently, to reference an icon of our day, LeBron James will say, "Well, I'm not political," but then comes out with like a very political endorsement of Hillary Clinton, right? So you're right that it one of the things that I guess it's a term Jameson uses more so in American Utopia is sort of reimagining education as cultural revolution, and I think an important aspect of that, reimagining of education in that way is exposing, the function of ideology in maintaining any system.
So I think I would have two questions. Maybe you could clarify what we mean by this notion of ideology.
Yeah.
And then how is it that Jameson is advancing education as a space within which some sort of occurrence, some sort of significant event can enter into?
So really, I would say really to define ideology, you'd have to turn to Louis Althusser, famously Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses. And it might be initially a complicated definition, but maybe we can sort of tease out the core idea here. But he says that ideology is basically it's a set of codes that's designed to reproduce the relations of production, which is a very, very loaded Marxist statement. But basically it's a hidden messages, hidden codes that are functioning in that way to maintain the status quo, right? To maintain the system that has produced them, like those messages and those codes themselves. So and so to your second question, remind me again.
Well, just more explicitly or in greater detail,
education.
How does Jameson advance that education is a domain within which one can reawaken the political or affect a movement toward realizing some utopia?
Yeah. Well, I would say in that way, if we think about ideology as sort of maintaining the status quo, it's, the Cultural Revolution, like we should see education always as a continual dismantling and rebuilding of the status quo, as in it's not a concept that is preserved, or that is immutable, right? But to envision it as a very mutable, as a very mercurial quality, and so because education, if you think about how loaded that term is, we treat education as a way of we think of it as liberal arts, right? But it's very much like, again, preparing people to be a mode of production themselves, right? So it's a way of, I think in renaming education as Cultural Revolution, it's a way of extricating that term from a system of production.
Or, alternatively, we could examine how, by renaming it, and this maybe can connect with the notion of discursive struggle. Well, it does. What you are doing is you are illuminating its political character.
Sure.
But we're coming up on another break, so let's save that for the subsequent segment.
Okay.
I feel like we're barely getting going. But that's the nature of such interrogations. Hey, we're back. Picking up with the thread of education. So, in really sort of another stage of the development in Frederic Jameson's thought is his book American Utopia, in which, as we noted, he sees the category of the political as withering away, or the space or the domain of the political as one about which he is pessimistic as a ground from which to elicit positive societal transformation. And in lieu of that space, he puts forth the idea of renovating the sphere of education, which he would not term education. He would say we need to reimagine it as a kind of cultural revolution. But this is itself to introduce some problematics, such as how do you extricate education from its enmeshment with, and we'll just use the word here, the capitalist project of reproduction, or the reproduction of capitalist class relations? Or how do you extricate it from its affiliation with certain institutional structures governmentally without even immediately noting the tie-in to capitalist class relations?
And I would say too that, I think Jameson would say that those two systems, state, capitalism, are inextricably linked anyway. So it's kind of one and the same network of, that is producing this education, right? That is defining the education in a way that allows the system to maintain, right? And so you are right that there is obviously, on simply the level of reimagining education as cultural revolution, like transforming the process itself is a type of rebellion, right? Is a type of revolution. But also there's also another battle going on here, which is on the level of the words themselves. There's this discursive struggle to use a different vocabulary to describe, right? And in lieu of describing it as education and describing it as cultural revolution, there's a whole Marxist agenda and social program that is sort of inherent in that terminology.
Yeah, I mean, go on.
Yeah, no.
I mean, it's just like, I don't know. I'm admittedly actually not entirely comfortable with what is definitely a provocative choice on Jameson's part with the words cultural revolution. And just to look out just that term draws us into a discursive struggle.
Sure.
In the popular American imagination, you use that pairing of terms, you're immediately going to think of Maoism, the Chinese Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution construed in a particularly dark light, which isn't necessarily a reflection of what actually unfolded there.
Sure.
So, there's the struggle there.
Yep.
What do you mean by cultural revolution? Doesn't that draw us into the same morass as we find in China? And so you see all those terms, right? Like, whoa, hold up, that's not what actually happened. You have to talk about that. Or you can look at the term of education and say, should we understand education as something which is fundamentally conservative or preservative, or as something which is, to use a word that will also invite struggle, insurgent? Should education be conceived as something which provokes transformation as opposed to retains or preserves standing structures?
Yeah, he sees it as a negation. He sees it as a negation at this point of late, capitalist ideology. But and I will totally agree that I'm not necessarily completely comfortable with a lot of what's presented in an American Utopia, especially the whole dual power idea.
What does he mean by dual power?
Well, sort of like a construction of a power to oppose that, or not necessarily oppose, but that is, well, maybe so, but that is separate from that of the state or that of, capitalism, like a separate structure. And he kind of goes through different options of what that could be, that power structure, what could be. But he ends up saying the legal system and some other things would be, in the end, you'd be unable to produce that separate power structure with those, and ends up going by way of sort of nationalizing the army. And it's a plan I haven't necessarily completely evaluated yet. So it's one of those things where not quite sure about that vector for sort of this revolution that he's or this utopia that he's proposing. But it's radical, and it's one that a lot of leftist thinkers have had to consider in a way that kind of disrupts even their imagining of the collective, of the formation of collective. So it's fruitful at the very least in that regard. Yeah, but back to the idea of the discursive struggle. With that terminology, cultural revolution, it implies, well, and you are right, that one of the things we do have to do is re-examine historical accounts of the quote-unquote failure of socialist projects, right? Because, again, we should receive those texts as always already read, right? We should understand the dynamics of the act of interpretation of those historical events and realize that they could be colored and coded by the people interpreting them who operate under certain regimes, right? So we have to be aware of that. And Jameson sees the failure of socialism. I don't necessarily think I recall any specific sort of revisiting of China, but it looks at the failure in Russia as not a failure of socialism, but a failure of federalism. So I mean, there's a re-examining of those historical events that we could undertake in a way to, again, recuperate socialism, right? And that's something that he points out too. Something he praises of Bernie Sanders is that Bernie Sanders takes the word socialist or socialism, which there was so much that was a battleground word itself, right? Like in the previous two elections, the word socialist was used to brand Obama. It was used itself as like a curse word by a lot of people.
It is a pejorative.
Pejorative, yeah. And Bernie Sanders then has reinvested that word socialist and socialism with a lot of positivity, and in that way is contributed.
Of course, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, this raises another set of concerns. It's very easy to become almost too exacting. So I want to admit that what I'm about to say could be read as a tad perfectionist. But there's a problematic which arises in tandem with Bernie Sanders as someone who has allowed socialism to re-enter the conversation.
Sure.
And what the problematic is stands that he's ultimately a merely reformist politician. He does not have a deep structural antagonism, or he doesn't have a deep antagonism to relying on the structure of the market. This is why we need to modify and attenuate market repercussions in some serious ways, but ultimately he is not interested in overthrowing a regime where one class dominates all the others, which is
Sure.
what we have, and it's what we have, I would say, in virtue of the hegemony or the dominance of capitalist modes of reproduction.
Sure. And
so
to clarify, I wouldn't say that Bernie Sanders, the man, has sort of
Or the
restored,
movement.
or the movement has
Okay.
restored socialism to a place of prominence, or that he represents.
but he's a mainstream politician.
Sure. But what I'd
Working in a mainstream structure.
Yeah.
And I guess that's where my skepticism is found. It's like, can we even
Right.
pretend
Yeah.
that we can get somewhere within this structure?
And so I would say that, to clarify again, that it's that Bernie Sanders has reinvested the word socialist and socialism with positivity, not necessarily that he represents anything. And I would agree with you too, and so would Jameson, that late capitalism is unable to produce a true democracy, a true collective.
Right.
Yeah, it's inherently
Well, even the
unable.
word collective
Problematic.
is going to, for many people, stir as kind of negative emotionality.
Sure.
You have this notion of uniformity that horizontalizes and negates the spontaneous development of the individual.
Sure. So even the word collective could be reimagined in a more positive.
Yes.
Like-
So we'll have to take this up on the other side of this last break.
All right.
So, we're coming out at the notion of the collective, or this concept of the collective, the concept of democracy. These are all, the contest for discourse, the discursive struggle is so crucial, because if we aren't alive to what we mean by what we say, we really can be co-opted into participation in power relations, which if we were asked directly about that participation, we would oppose it. So much by way of opening the segment with a cliche, but you have suggested, along I think with Jameson, that we have to maybe recuperate the idea of the collective. Maybe you could explicate what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, I think even Jameson thinks that, he doesn't necessarily say we need to, as I mentioned before the break, that we could reimagine the word collective or reinvest it with sort of positive connotations. He thinks it's just a problematic term, and that we haven't yet really come up with a satisfactory term for what might be called that sort of realization of, I guess, a classless society and that sort of utopian vision. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's just more work to be done. But maybe that's what you're looking for in the definition of the collective. It's like this a classless, society, right? I mean, that's the sort of a Marxist vision of utopia, right?
I mean, just trying to think of other candidate terms.
Mm-hmm.
The word community comes to mind. And for some reason, and this is a term which is associated with a particular theological trajectory, which I don't necessarily want to import, but the idea of the beloved community.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so bottom line, negatively, what do we want to negate? We want to negate class, or the idea that the countenancing of class is something which should continue. Okay, positively, what are we trying to construct? To enter into the space which would be opened by the negation of class.
Right. So
let me ask that of you, not just as a rhetorical question.
Well, that I think that's I think that is a very big question, right? Like that is the question. In a sense. Like that is what to replace, right? I mean, really, mm-hmm. Right? What is the affirmation, right? After the negation, what values do we affirm? I think there's a lot of really great thinkers who come to say that, okay, well, our collective should be defined in this way. I think that's the whole project of social justice, right? Is to say, how do we define social justice. Some people would say that that community should be defined by, like you said, an openness, a capability, right? Martha Nussbaum and her capabilities approach would be an interesting book to take a look at in terms of defining that community. I think Bookchin, in which you mentioned with Bookchin, in terms of the, reimagining the community as the political arena, right, instead of the state as the arena. Mm-hmm. I think that would be a big part of it. I think you're going to be deriving a lot of your values from a lot of different thinkers and positions, right, about a lot of these ideas. But that is, I think, the goal. Should be the project for all of us to try and define and determine what is that. What will we affirm in that collective, in that community? But I think to go back to some fundamental principles, you are right that for some reason there, and maybe it's a product of how we view languages in very binary terms, that like the collective is always seen as antithetical to the individual, right? And so maybe in that way, like sort of reimagining the collective not as a negation of individual pursuits, but that fairness, ideals of fairness and reciprocity can still exist in a way that maybe satisfies individual desires.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to be highlighted from your response is that you can really draw from multiple sources when marshaling a response in terms of what is to be positively constituted. And I would say that another element is to move away from construing things economically, or to use the Marxist distinction. Well, it's not strictly Marxist, but between use value and exchange value. But that's kind of jargony. What I mean is that we need to begin addressing our needs directly without leaning so heavily on the idea that those responses have to be mediated in market terms. Mm-hmm. So healthcare, for instance, the idea that people are sick and that they are dying or injured and we need to care for them should not be one that is subordinated to a logic of commodity. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm personally always sort of left somewhat aghast,
right,
when people talk about healthcare consumption.
Right.
So, we need to sort of de-economize the way we discuss things.
Agreed. And again, that's part of the negation, right? But as a writer too, to bring things back to something that Jameson mentions early in The Political Unconscious, is Jameson sort of moves beyond Roland Barthes' breakdown of the writerly and the readerly text, but at the same time, I would say that there you have maybe not in the lexicon itself, but maybe in the stylistic choices, you have sort of this capitalist ideology inhering, right? So you have like this style that is all about economy, right? That is all about efficiency, right? Whereas then you could have a entirely contrary style of producing written work, which might be alternately called lyrical, right, or however you want to define it, but it's one that pays close attention to the texture of the language itself. And in that way, it's sort of an active rejection of sort of that very mechanistic.
You could look at something like the magical realism of like someone like Gabriel Garcia Marquez as maybe providing a counterpoint. Would that be an example, or?
Well,
I was just talking about him earlier, so that's maybe why he came to mind. But he like has this different universe that
sure.
is.
And I mean even more. There's countless, and I mean even more so on the sort of the level of language proper, right? And so like, but separate from the lexicon, it's like how the language is used. So if you for instance, if you use, maybe Dylan Thomas is the best example of a poet whose language might be very obscurant, but who pays very close attention to like the sounds of words, right? I mean, there's a lot of artists that we could point to. I think one of my favorite quotes from Terry Eagleton is that Nietzsche's Superman is not an email user, right? Like there's like this.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a great quote, and it's like that's a use of language, right, in sort of communication via emails that, like you said, is very much a part of that capitalist program and project, and it's a very economized and diluted use of language, and so there could be a principle there too, that in all things, or in the use of language, that sort of rejecting that model or that ideal of efficiency could be a way that we sort of create that or affirm a new ideal in community, collective.
Well, we're on the same page there. To put it one other, language should be provocative, not comforting. Provocation, that seems to be the background of what we see. We got to wrap it up, but it just seems like we're just getting going here. But that's what's important about having these kinds of conversations and these sorts of ideas, is that they're ultimately generative and creative in a way that mere formula cannot be. So thank you, Nick, for sitting down and talking with me here.
Thank you.
And thanks to Rob back there behind the camera. So, but I guess, do you have anything else to say before we?
No, a lot of fun to talk about this. Dialectic.
That's right. To the things themselves dialectically. So, too much rock and roll for one hand here, guys. So, woo! We'll close it out with that. So, have a lovely evening. I'll catch you guys later.